My name is Grace, and I'm an interpreter at the Charles Lindbergh House and Museum. And today we're going to be talking about the crime of the century, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. Before we dive into the details of this case, I'm going to briefly talk about the sociological implications of the United States during the 1920s and 1930s, as kidnapping became an epidemic during the Great Depression. The 1929 stock market crash that led to the Great Depression created a chasm between the rich and the poor that left many Americans desperate for money. Between 1929 and 1933, unemployment in the United States jumped from 3.2% to 24.9%, almost a quarter of the official labor force. In 1933, the end of the Prohibition, or the complete ban on the sale and consumption of alcohol, also left bootleggers and rum runners out of work. This desperation led to an uptick of violent crime during this era. Kidnapping wealthy families became an easy way to make money. By 1931, it is estimated that more than 3,000 kidnappings had occurred in the United States. However, the lack of reliable statistics make it impossible to confirm. Whether there were less or more, kidnapping increased dramatically as a result of organized crime, lawlessness, and corruption of law enforcement. The kidnapping and murder of Charlie Jr. pushed the nation to collectively grieve over the baby of a national hero. It also created urgency for change and harsher punishments for these crimes. On May 21, 1927, a single-engine plane landed at Le Bourget Airport just outside of Paris. Charles Augustus Lindbergh stepped out to greet 150,000 people, as he had just been the first pilot to complete a transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. Charles Lindbergh became an instant celebrity. In 1929, Charles met Anne Morrow, the daughter of Dwight Morrow, the American ambassador to Mexico. Anne Morrow was a recent graduate of Smith College, where she majored in English literature and studied creative writing. After a short courtship, the couple quietly wed in May of 1929. The weekend before the kidnapping, Charles Jr. had a slight cold. Normally, the family would have returned to Next Day Hill in Englewood, New Jersey. Next Day Hill was the family home of the Morrows. Anne and Charles stayed at Next Day Hill during the construction of their family home in Hopewell, New Jersey. On Sunday, the family decided to stay an extra night because the weather was not favorable. On Tuesday, Charles Jr. was still ill, so the family decided to return to Englewood on Wednesday. At 7:30 on March 1, 1932, Charlie Jr. was put to bed. Anne returned to the library, and the nurse checked on Charlie Jr. around 8 p.m. Charles Lindbergh returned to the home around 8:30 p.m., and the couple enjoyed a dinner together. At 9 p.m., Charles had reported hearing a sharp noise that he described as wood breaking and assumed it came from the kitchen. Around 10 p.m., when the nurse returned to check on the baby, Charlie Jr. was gone from his crib. Charles Lindbergh's search of the premises revealed a ransom note on the windowsill. After the initial police call to the Hopewell PD, the New Jersey State Police were immediately notified and assumed charge of the investigation. By the early hours of March 2, 1932, the whole world knew about the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. So what was found at the crime scene? There were traces of mud on the floor, a 3/4-inch chisel, 2 sets of muddy footprints under the nursery window, and 2 sections of a ladder that had been used to reach the second-story window. One of the sections was broken, indicating that the ladder broke during the ascent or descent of the kidnapper. There was no blood stains nor fingerprints discovered at the crime scene. On March 6th, the Lindbergh family received a second ransom note. The ransom demand was increased to $70,000. A police conference was then called by the governor at Trenton, New Jersey, which was attended by prosecuting officials, police authorities, and government representatives. Various theories and policies of procedure were discussed. Private investigators were also employed by Colonel Lindbergh's attorney, Colonel Henry Breckinridge. Dr. John Condon was chosen both by Charles Lindbergh and the abductor to act as an intermediary. After a series of communications, $50,000 in gold certificates were paid by the Lindbergh family to the abductor. Lindbergh drove Condon to the cemetery with the ransom money. Condon met with the abductor and was able to provide the police with a description. The police produced a sketch. The Lindbergh family wanted proof of the child's identity. With the 7th ransom note, the kidnapper agreed to produce a token. A sleep suit was given to Condon that was later identified by Lindbergh. Other interested parties contacted the Lindberghs in offer of assistance. Morris Mickey Rosner, a small-time real estate dealer, claimed he was an underworld emissary that had connections with kidnapping gangs. Rosner claimed that Abby Wagner was responsible for the kidnapping. Wagner had been involved with high-profile kidnappings of Broadway racketeers. Rosner was not able to provide the police with any significant information about the kidnapping, but did offer the Lindberghs a piece of advice. It is far more important to get their baby back and pay the price, rather than throw the child at the mercy of 3 police departments who are fighting for glory. Rosner would turn out to be right about competing investigations. Lindbergh reached out to mobster Frank Costello for his ties to the mafia. Costello sent his men to gather information and reported back to Colonel Henry Breckinridge. A few days later, Costello was convinced that the underworld had nothing to do with the kidnapping of Charlie Jr. Costello believed that the baby was already dead and instructed Lindbergh not to pay the ransom. More famously, Al Capone reached out to the Lindbergh family and offered assistance under the condition he would be released from prison. The Lindberghs did not respond. A total of 13 notes were exchanged by the kidnappers and the Lindbergh family. Despite the Lindberghs paying the ransom, the baby was never returned. On May 12, 1932, 72 days after the kidnapping, the corpse of a small child was discovered in the woods surrounding the Lindbergh estate in a shallow grave. The body was badly decomposed and some of the body members were missing. An initial review of the body suggested that Charles Jr. had suffered from blunt force trauma, suffering 3 fractures to his skull. The body was positively identified by Charles Lindbergh to be his son's. Following the murder, a photographer broke into the morgue and snapped a picture of the corpse. Copies of the image were distributed for $5. The photos were so grotesque that no newspaper at the time would publish them. However, many prints ended up in speakeasies or unlicensed saloons that sold bootlegged alcohol during the Prohibition. Charles Lindbergh ordered the body of his son to be cremated immediately. The press swarmed the location of the body's discovery, destroying any evidence that could have been salvaged from the scene. The aftermath of the discovery of Charlie Jr. was devastating. The Lindberghs never stayed at their Hopewell estate again. Anne wrote, "I feel strangely a sense of peace. Not peace, but an end to restlessness, a finality, as though I were sleeping in a grave." Charles Lindbergh was on a ship in the middle of the ocean when he received the news. After they paid the ransom, they were told Charlie Jr. was on a boat. Anne wrote in her diary that after Charles received the news, he was focused on the bigger picture and insisted they try to move on. One day after the discovery of the child's corpse, President Herbert Hoover directed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation should be at the disposal of the state of New Jersey. However, J. Edgar Hoover did not want to be at the disposal of the NYPD or the New Jersey State Police, as he felt that the FBI was being used as errand boys and would not further assist on the case unless asked specifically by Lindbergh or the NJSP. After internal conflicts between Herbert Hoover, the FBI, and the NJSP, the FBI established its own investigation with hand-picked agents to follow up on every lead related to the Lindbergh case. The FBI would not share any information with the Lindberghs or the NJSP. The lead investigator of NJSP, Norman Schwarzkopf, was constantly criticized by the FBI, Hoover, and the media after the discovery of the baby's corpse. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle wrote that Schwarzkopf lacks anything indicating he was qualified to adequately handle the greatest criminal investigation of modern history. Likewise, Senator Emerson Richards of New Jersey threatened to open a Senate investigation into the actions of the NJSP mishandling the case. The police had several suspects: Betty Gow, the child's nurse; Violet Sharp, friend of Betty Gow and worker at the Edgewood estate where the Lindberghs resided; Mr. Oliver Watley and his wife, Elise, both servants at the house during the time of the kidnapping. All suspects were cleared by the police. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected as President of the United States and almost immediately suspended the circulation of gold certificates. This aided the investigation immensely, as banks were instructed to notify the FBI immediately if any gold certificates came through matching the serial numbers on the ransom bills. On September 18, 1934, a tip from a gas station attendant led police to the arrest of Bruno Hauptmann. One of the gold certificates with the traceable serial numbers was used by Hauptmann to purchase 98 cents worth of gas. Suspicious of the gold certificate, the gas attendant wrote down the license number and turned it into the bank. The bank then notified the FBI. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was an immigrant from Germany that fought in World War I as a machine gunner. He was wounded during his service and returned to Commons after the war. Hauptmann attended a trade school for carpentry and machinery. After World War I, the economy in Germany was wounded and work was scarce. In March of 1918, he stole 300 marks and a silver watch. He then robbed a leather tanner in Commons and stole 200 marks, a gold watch, and a chain. Lastly, he stole food from 2 housewives. Hauptmann was arrested and convicted of all 3 robberies and sentenced to 5 years. In 1923, he was paroled and again arrested for selling stolen goods. In November of 1923, he ran and boarded a ship to the United States. Shortly after, he met and married Anna Schofler in October of 1925 and had a child. When the market crashed in October of 1929, Bruno, like so many Americans, was unable to find work. Bruno then told his wife that he had a foolproof plan to make money on the stock market. Hauptmann was arrested by police on September 19, 1934, and brought into police custody for questioning. A search of Hauptmann's home revealed $19,700 in gold certificates, all with the trace serial numbers. Hauptmann denied his involvement in the kidnapping. On September 26, Hauptmann was charged with extortion. Days later, on October 8th, charges of kidnapping and murder were added. The trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann began on January 3, 1935, in Flemington, New Jersey. 60,000 people, including reporters, novelists, movie stars, and society matrons, flooded the small New Jersey town. The trial lasted 5 weeks. The case built against him was largely circumstantial. Charles Lindbergh testified that he recognized Hauptmann's voice from the cemetery when he dropped off Dr. John Condon with the ransom money. During a police lineup, Condon was called to identify Hauptmann. Hauptmann was put in a lineup with 4 patrolmen and 9 detectives from the NYPD and NJSP instead of jailed prisoners. Special Agent Leon Thoreau of the FBI recalled, Hauptmann looking like a midget who wandered into a Turkish bath next to the clean-shaven, 6-foot, bright-eyed police officers. Condon could not positively identify Hauptmann in the lineup. A few days later, Condon claimed that Hauptmann was the man he met in the cemetery. During his testimony, Condon further asserted that Hauptmann was the man. Dr. Condon's telephone number and address were found scrawled on the doorframe inside of a closet in the Hauptmann house. Handwriting analysis was done after an initial interview with Hauptmann. The handwriting specialist declared he had a number of mental reservations that Hauptmann was the author. However, by the time of the trial, he identified Hauptmann as the writer, after he examined the handwriting more thoroughly and with different samples. Norman Schwarzkopf of the New Jersey Police Department had previously hired expert Arthur Kohler of the United States Forest Service to examine the ladder found at the crime scene. For 2 years, Kohler disassembled the ladder and identified the types of wood used and examined tool marks. He also looked at the pattern made by nail holes, for it appeared likely that some wood had been used before in indoor construction. Kohler made trips to the Lindbergh and Hauptmann estates and to factories to trace some of the wood. From this report, the police were able to determine that the wood from the rail 16 on the ladder matched the wood used as flooring in Hauptmann's attic. Tool marks on the ladder matched tools owned by Hauptmann. Hauptmann was defended by Edward J. Riley, a 52-year-old well-known defense attorney. Dubbed the Bull of Brooklyn, Riley boasted that he had represented more than 2,000 defendants and claimed that he had acquitted a majority of them. However, his defense was weak. Riley maintained his client's innocence and blamed the crime on Isidore Fish. Hauptmann and Fish were business partners in the fur business. Fish returned to Germany in 1933, but before he left some of his belongings with Hauptmann, including the money found during the police search of Hauptmann's house. Fish died of tuberculosis in Germany in 1934. The defense attempted to counter the handwriting analysis with John M. Trenley of East St. Louis. Trenley was an imitator who imitated other people's handwriting to try and trick handwriting experts. Trenley also compared the ransom notes to Hauptmann's writing and declared that Hauptmann had not written the ransom notes. The defense also objected to the testimony of Kohler, the head of the Department of U.S. Agriculture, stating there is no such animal known among men as an expert on wood. The objection was overruled, and the testimony of Kohler was the final evidence needed to convict Hauptmann. Reportedly, Hauptmann asked his defense counsel, "Where are you getting these witnesses? They are killing me." On February 13, 1935, the jury found Hauptmann guilty and sentenced him to death. After losing an appeal and granted 30-day extension by the governor of New Jersey, Hauptmann was electrocuted on April 3, 1936. As a result of the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the Federal Kidnapping Act, or Lindbergh Law, was enacted on June 22, 1932, on what would have been Charlie Jr.'s 2nd birthday, making kidnapping across state lines a federal crime. The Lindbergh baby was found murdered less than 4 miles from his home, and there was no evidence that he had been transported across the state line. Had the Lindbergh Law been in effect when young Charlie was kidnapped, it would not have applied to this case. In fact, the bill that ultimately became the Lindbergh Law was not introduced in the wake of that sensational crime, nor was it introduced by members of the New Jersey delegation that represented the Lindbergh family and the state. Instead, it had been introduced 3 months before the Lindbergh abduction by Senator Roscoe Conkling Patterson of Missouri and City Representative John Joseph Cochran of St. Louis. Kidnappings were incredibly common in St. Louis and Kansas City, as these cities were influenced by organized crime. The proximity of the Mississippi River made it easy to transport victims across state lines, thus the urgency to enact a law. Because of the popularity and sensationalism of the Lindbergh case, the bill was unanimously passed and allowed the FBI and U.S. Marshals to pursue kidnapping across state lines, overstepping state police. The case also ignited a wider call of harsher punishments for criminals. And now to address some of the conspiracy theories. From the beginning, the police firmly believed that more than one person was involved in the kidnapping. The police also believed that someone who knew the family and their movements well had to be involved. The family was supposed to return to the Morrow estate in Englewood after the weekend, but because of Charlie Jr.'s illness, they stayed. The kidnapper also had intimate knowledge of the whereabouts of the nursery and the layout of the home. One conspiracy is that one of the household staff was involved, particularly Violet Sharp. Violet Sharp was a maid in the Morrow estate in Englewood, New Jersey. She was an English immigrant in her late 20s. Early on, the police suspected that she had something to do with the kidnapping because she knew the Lindbergh schedule. Sharp also was inconsistent with her alibi and appeared to police anxious and defensive. After the police phoned her to tell her that she would be questioned again, Sharp committed suicide by cyanide. The police were able to clear Violet Sharp by locating the man she was with that night, but lingering questions remain. The conspiracy theory that seems to be most popular is that Charles Lindbergh himself was involved with the abduction of his son. Lloyd Gardner, Rutgers University historian, is probably the lead historian on this theory. State police suggested that this kidnapping had to have been committed by a group and someone from the inside had helped, which is why vigorous interrogations occurred of the house servants. Charles Lindbergh had a fascination with social Darwinism and eugenics. Lindbergh adhered to the racial superiority of Northern Europeans, particularly Germans and Scandinavians. According to Gardner, his desire to spread his healthy genes and his belief in eugenics reflected in his secret affairs with 3 German women in the 1950s that produced 7 children besides the 6 he had with his wife, Anne Morrow. There's pretty good evidence to suggest that little Charlie dealt with health issues. The health and physical conditions were largely downplayed and hidden from the public and law enforcement by Lindbergh and Charlie Jr.'s physician. Charlie Jr. appeared to be afflicted with rickets disease, which is caused by a severe vitamin D and calcium deficiency. Children with rickets are often bow-legged, have delayed motor and physical developments, and muscle weakness. Charlie Jr. was bow-legged, had hammer toes on his left foot, and a large cranium with fused skull bones. Rickets is treated with aggressive vitamin therapy and a strict diet. Sometimes it can be treated with surgery. According to Gardner, Charles Lindbergh's behavior during the investigation also warrants questioning. The aviator took charge of the investigation. He isolated household staff who may have had knowledge of his son's medical conditions from questioning by authorities, including J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI. Following a cursory autopsy, Charles demanded the body be cremated before any further autopsies could be performed, eliminating critical evidence. Gardner also throws into question the whereabouts of Lindbergh the night of the kidnapping. Lindbergh inadvertently missed a public speaking engagement in New York City, instead returning to the estate that night. It is important to note that these are just theories and currently do not have evidence to reopen the Lindbergh investigation. However, we recognize the conspiracy theories as having a huge impact on the way the case is studied today. The doubts of the outcome of this trial are not new. After the conviction of Hauptmann, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt stated, "It seemed the verdict had been based entirely on circumstantial evidence. While not in sympathy with Hauptmann, I was a little perturbed at the thought of what might happen to any innocent person in a similar situation. The entire trial left me with a question in my mind, and I was certainly glad that I did not have to sit on that jury." 90 years after the abduction and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr., questions about the case are still left unanswered. The most important questions surrounding the guilt of Hauptmann concern the handling of the case by the FBI and the NJSP, where there have been accusations of mishandling evidence and the destruction of fingerprints. Special Agent Leon Theroux also reported that Hauptmann had been beaten while in police custody. Lastly, the credibility of Lindbergh and Dr. Congdon as witnesses and the intense testimony of Kohler has baffled anyone who's studied the case in the last 90 years.
Special thanks to the Laura Jane Musser Fund for making this and other educational videos possible. If you enjoyed this presentation, please come visit us at the Charles Lindbergh House and Museum.